In just 43 seconds, one of Britain's most beloved actors completely lost his composure on live television, unleashing a verbal assault so fierce that it left the host visibly shaken and the studio audience in stunned silence. What started as a simple chat about his latest film descended into a full-blown character assassination that no one saw coming, ending with Hugh Grant storming off set while cameras were still rolling. Before we dive into this explosive confrontation, make sure you subscribe to our channel. We bring you daily videos exposing Britain's darkest scandals, the moments they tried to hide, and the confrontations that left the nation talking. Hit that subscribe button now because you won't want to miss what happens next. The atmosphere in the studio last night was electric from the moment Hugh Grant walked onto Lorraine Kelly's set. He was there to promote his new thriller, but something was already off. His jaw was tight, his smile forced, and when Lorraine greeted him with her signature warmth, he barely made eye contact. The audience could sense it. This wasn't going to be the cheerful conversation they were expecting. Lorraine started with what seemed like a harmless question about his new role, asking him how he prepared for such an intense character. Hugh's response was clipped, almost dismissive. "I just did the work," he said flatly, crossing his arms. "That's what actors do, isn't it?" Lorraine laughed nervously, trying to keep things light. Of course, but your fans love hearing about your process, Hugh. They're fascinated by you." "Are they?" Hugh replied, his tone ice cold. "Or are they just fascinated by whatever narrative gets spun about me?" The shift in energy was immediate. Lorraine's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered, but you could see the confusion in her eyes. She pressed forward, mentioning how he'd been in the public eye for decades and how he'd handled the ups and downs of fame with such grace. That's when Hugh's expression darkened completely. "Grace?" he repeated, leaning forward in his chair. "Is that what we're calling it now? Because I seem to remember a certain morning show host being part of the problem when things got rough for me." The audience went silent. Lorraine's face flushed red, but she kept her composure, at least on the surface. "Hugh, I don't know what you're referring to." "Don't you?" Hugh cut her off sharply. "Let me refresh your memory then. 20 years ago, when the tabloids were tearing me apart, when I was going through the worst period of my life, this very show ran segments dissecting every mistake I'd ever made. You sat right there in that chair and picked me apart like I was a piece of meat." Lorraine shifted uncomfortably, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "Hugh, we cover the news. That's what we do, and if I recall correctly, those were difficult times for you. But we always tried to be fair." "Fair?" Hugh's voice rose, cutting through the studio. "You call it fair to have panel discussions about my personal life? To bring on so-called experts to analyze my character? To laugh and joke about my lowest moments?" The cameras captured every second of Lorraine's face as it shifted from confused to defensive. "That's not how I remember it at all. We reported on what was happening, yes, but we never—" "You never what? Never judged? Never contributed to the feeding frenzy?" Hugh was on a roll now, his British politeness completely abandoned. "Do you have any idea what it's like to watch yourself being discussed like a zoo animal? To have people like you profit from your pain?" Lorraine tried to regain control of the conversation, her voice taking on a firmer edge. "Hugh, I understand you're upset, but this is live television. Perhaps we should talk about your film." "No," Hugh said firmly, sitting back in his chair with his arms crossed. "No, I don't think we will. Because this is exactly the problem, isn't it? You want me to come here, smile, promote my film, play the game. But the moment I bring up how you treated me, how this industry chewed me up and spat me out, suddenly it's inappropriate?" The tension in the studio was suffocating. Crew members could be heard shuffling nervously off camera. Lorraine's producer was likely screaming in her earpiece. But she was trapped. This was live. There was no escape. "Hugh, I think you're being unfair," Lorraine said, her voice wavering slightly. "If there were moments where our coverage upset you, I'm sorry. But we were doing our jobs. We're journalists." "Journalists?" Hugh let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what you call yourselves? Journalists uncover truth. They hold power to account. What you do is gossip dressed up as news. You profit from human misery and call it entertainment." Lorraine's face was now completely red. Her hands were trembling slightly, and her voice took on a defensive tone that viewers hadn't heard from her before. That's completely unfair and frankly quite offensive. We've built a career on being kind, on being positive, on being fake," Hugh interrupted coldly. "On pretending to care while simultaneously feeding your audience whatever will get them to keep watching. Do you know what that makes you? A hypocrite." The word hung in the air like a bomb. Lorraine's mouth opened and closed, struggling to find words. When she finally spoke, her voice was sharp and defensive in a way that surprised everyone watching. "How dare you come on my show and attack me like this?" she said, her famous warmth completely gone. "I've been nothing but welcoming to you. I invited you here to talk about your work, and you're using this platform to launch some kind of personal vendetta?" "Personal vendetta?" Hugh leaned forward again, his eyes blazing. "This isn't personal. This is about accountability. This is about all of you in this industry who built careers on the backs of people suffering and never once stopped to think about the damage you were doing." "We never targeted you specifically," Lorraine shot back, her voice rising to match his. "You were in the news, Hugh. Things happened. We reported on them. That's our job." "Reported?" Hugh's voice dripped with sarcasm. "You mean you invited on relationship experts to speculate about my private life? You mean you had body language analysts dissect my every movement? You mean you ran headlines that you knew would generate clicks and views, regardless of whether they were true or not?" Lorraine was fully on the defensive now, all pretense of her usual sunny demeanor completely shattered. "That's how the media works. If you can't handle that, maybe you shouldn't be in the public eye." The audience gasped. Even Lorraine seemed to realize she'd gone too far, but Hugh pounced on it immediately. "There it is," he said quietly, a dangerous edge to his voice. "The mask finally drops. If I can't handle being exploited, being turned into a punchline, being treated like less than human, then I shouldn't be in the public eye? That's your defense?" "That's not what I meant," Lorraine said quickly, trying to backtrack. "I just meant that there's a certain level of scrutiny that comes with fame." "Don't patronize me," Hugh snapped. "I know what comes with fame. I've been famous longer than most of your staff have been alive. But there's a difference between scrutiny and cruelty. There's a difference between reporting and vulturing. And you've spent decades on the wrong side of that line." Lorraine's face was a mixture of anger and something that looked almost like shame, but she wasn't backing down. "You know what, Hugh? I think you're projecting. I think you're angry about how your own choices played out, and you're looking for someone to blame. But that's not on me. That's not on this show. We didn't make you do anything." "No, but you sure as hell made money from it," Hugh fired back. "Every headline, every segment, every time you invited someone on to discuss my personal life, you were profiting. You were building your brand on my pain, and now you're sitting there acting like the victim because I'm finally calling you out on it." The studio was in chaos now. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay silent. Some people were looking at each other uncomfortably, while others were filming on their phones. The crew was clearly receiving instructions, probably to cut to commercial, but Lorraine seemed determined to defend herself. "I have never, ever set out to hurt anyone," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Everything I've done in my career has been about celebrating people, lifting them up." "Bollocks," Hugh said flatly, and the profanity made several audience members gasp. "Absolute bollocks, and you know it. You celebrate people when it's convenient, when they're playing along with your narrative. But the moment someone shows vulnerability, the moment someone makes a mistake, you're right there with the rest of them, picking at the bones." "That's not true!" Lorraine was almost shouting now, completely losing her composure. "I've had difficult conversations, yes, but I've always tried to be compassionate." "Compassionate?" Hugh let out a harsh laugh. "You want to talk about compassion? Where was your compassion when I was dealing with actual death threats because of the way the media was portraying me? Where was your compassion when I couldn't leave my house without being mobbed because shows like yours had whipped the public into a frenzy?" "That's not fair," Lorraine said, her voice cracking. "We can't be held responsible for how individuals react." "You absolutely can." Hugh was on his feet now, towering over the desk. "When you spend hour after hour, day after day, painting someone as a monster, as a joke, as something less than human, you create an environment where people feel justified in their cruelty. You give them permission." The camera zoomed in on Lorraine's face, capturing the moment her carefully constructed public persona completely crumbled. She looked genuinely rattled, her eyes glistening with what might have been tears or might have been rage. "I never called you a monster," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't have to," Hugh replied, his voice cold and final. "You just sat there while your guests did it for you. You nodded along. You laughed at their jokes. You enabled it all while maintaining your image as the nice one, the kind one. That's what makes it worse, Lorraine. At least the tabloid journalists are honest about being vultures. You dress it up in cheerfulness and call it kindness." "Get out," Lorraine said suddenly, her voice trembling with fury. "Get out of my studio. Right now." Hugh smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Gladly. But before I go, I want everyone watching to understand something. This industry, this machine that churns through people's lives for entertainment, it only works because people like her enable it. They profit from it, and they never, ever take responsibility for the damage they cause." "I said get out." Lorraine was standing now too, pointing toward the exit. Her face was red and blotchy, tears streaming down her cheeks, all composure completely gone. "You don't get to come on my show and treat me like this. Security." "I'm going," Hugh said calmly, unclipping his microphone. "But I'm not sorry. Not for a single word. Someone needed to say it, and I'm glad it was me." "You're finished," Lorraine shouted, her voice cracking. "Do you hear me? You're finished in this industry." Hugh paused at the edge of the set, turning back to look at her with something like pity in his eyes. "No, Lorraine, I'm not finished. But maybe you should be." The cameras captured every second as Hugh walked off the set, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence of the studio. Lorraine stood there, mascara running down her face, chest heaving, looking nothing like the polished professional Britain had come to know. She tried to speak, tried to address the camera, but only managed a choked sob before sitting back down heavily in her chair. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to applaud, comfort, or simply leave. Some people were crying. Others were whispering urgently to each other. The energy in the room had shifted so dramatically that it felt like everyone was recovering from a physical blow. "We'll be right back," Lorraine finally managed to say, her voice hollow and broken. But her eyes told a different story. They were filled with a mixture of humiliation, rage, and something that looked almost like defeat. The cameras kept rolling for a few more seconds, capturing Lorraine's hands shaking as she reached for a glass of water, the liquid sloshing over the rim as she brought it to her lips. Then, mercifully, the feed cut to commercial. But for those 43 seconds, and the brutal confrontation that followed, Britain had witnessed something unprecedented. They'd seen behind the curtain of morning television's forced cheerfulness. They'd watched a beloved actor tear down one of their most trusted presenters, piece by piece, accusation by accusation. And they'd seen Lorraine Kelly, the woman who'd built an empire on being relentlessly positive, completely fall apart on live television. The moment Hugh Grant walked off that set, he left behind more than just an unfinished interview. He left behind wreckage, questions, uncomfortable truths about an industry that profits from human vulnerability while pretending to care. And he left Lorraine Kelly sitting in her chair, her carefully cultivated image shattered, forced to confront accusations she'd spent decades avoiding. The studio audience filed out in silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. The crew scrambled to prepare for the show's return from commercial, but everyone knew nothing could salvage what had just happened. This wasn't just a celebrity spat. This wasn't just a difficult interview gone wrong. This was a reckoning, broadcast live to millions of homes across Britain. And as Hugh Grant walked through the studio's back corridors, past stunned staff members and gaping production assistants, he didn't look back. Not once. He'd said what he needed to say. He'd done what he came to do. Whether it would destroy his career or liberate it remained to be seen. But in that moment, walking out of Lorraine Kelly's studio with his head held high, he looked like a man who'd finally freed himself from decades of swallowed anger and forced smiles. Behind him, on that set, Lorraine Kelly sat in ruins, surrounded by the shattered pieces of her public persona, facing questions she'd never wanted to answer. The mask had slipped, the truth had emerged, and morning television would never quite be the same again. The confrontation that broke out last night between Hugh Grant and Lorraine Kelly wasn't just drama. It was a mirror held up to an entire industry, reflecting back all the ugliness that usually stays hidden behind bright lights and manufactured warmth. and for 43 seconds, followed by the most brutal minutes in daytime television history, no one could look away. Hugh Grant had walked onto that set with a purpose, and he'd accomplished it. He'd exposed the machinery. He'd called out the hypocrisy. He'd refused to play the game. And when Lorraine Kelly ordered him off her show, when she broke down in tears on live television, when her perfect presenter facade crumbled completely, it proved every word he'd said. The viewers at home watched in shock as Hugh disappeared through the studio doors. They'd tuned in expecting light entertainment, maybe some gentle promotion for a new film, perhaps a few amusing anecdotes from a beloved British actor. Instead, they got a masterclass in confrontation, a public reckoning decades in the making, and the sight of one of their most trusted television personalities completely losing control. As the show cut to commercial, as Lorraine sat there with tears streaming down her face and her hands shaking, as crew members rushed to comfort her while others stood frozen in shock, one thing was absolutely clear. This moment would define both of their careers. For Hugh Grant, it was a statement. For Lorraine Kelly, it was a disaster. And for everyone watching, it was a reminder that even the brightest, most cheerful facades can hide uncomfortable truths. The argument had started civil enough, but the moment Hugh began pressing his point, the moment he refused to let Lorraine deflect and dodge, everything escalated with terrifying speed. His accusations became more pointed. Her defenses became more desperate. And when she finally snapped, when she screamed at him to get out, when she threatened his career while crying on live television, she'd proven his entire argument for him. Hugh's exit from the studio was captured by every camera in the building, walking past shocked staff members, ignoring shouted questions from producers, moving with purpose toward the exit. He'd burned a bridge, certainly. He'd made an enemy, undoubtedly. But he'd also spoken a truth that many in the industry had been too afraid to say out loud. The British press would explode with this story within minutes. Social media would erupt with clips and commentary. Everyone would have an opinion on who was right and who was wrong. But in that moment, walking out of Lorraine Kelly's studio while she sat in ruins on her own set, Hugh Grant looked like a man who'd finally said what he'd been holding in for 20 years. And Lorraine Kelly, sitting alone at her desk as crew members rushed around her, as makeup artists tried to repair her tear-streaked face, as producers desperately tried to figure out how to salvage the rest of the show, looked like someone who'd just had their worst nightmare broadcast to the nation. The confrontation was over. The damage was done. And nothing in British daytime television would ever be quite the same again. Hugh Grant had made sure of that when he walked through those studio doors, leaving chaos and devastation in his wake.